Margaret Chen worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford Christmas dinner. Her 2 children, Marcus, 8, and Lisa, 6, had asked for nothing but food and time with their mother. On Christmas Eve, the power went out. The heating system died. The refrigerator, nearly empty, became colder still. By midnight, Margaret sat on the kitchen floor in the dark, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake moving to this town after her husband's death 2 years ago. She didn't know that one act of kindness, a stranger's hand on her shoulder at the grocery store, a phone call made at 1:33 a.m. would change everything. By dawn, the rumble of motorcycle engines would shake her quiet street. By sunrise, her kitchen would be filled with warmth, food, and a promise kept by men who understood what it meant to have nothing and what it meant to give everything. The thermostat read 34 degrees. Margaret Chen stood in her kitchen, barefoot on linoleum that hadn't been updated since 1987, watching her breath crystallize in the overhead light. Outside, snow fell in thick, relentless sheets against the window above the sink. Inside, the ancient boiler had surrendered sometime around 9 p.m., releasing a sound like a dying animal before going silent. She wrapped her cardigan tighter, the same one she'd worn for 3 years, fraying at the cuffs, pilled across the shoulders from too many machine washes. Down the hallway, she could hear Marcus and Lisa whispering in their shared bedroom. They were supposed to be asleep, but children know when the world is breaking. They could sense it in the temperature of the house, in the way their mother's footsteps moved faster, sharper, with less certainty. Margaret opened the refrigerator. Cold air spilled out, not the kind of cold that refreshed, but the kind that mocked. Half a gallon of milk expiring tomorrow, 2 eggs, a container of leftover rice 3 days old. Some carrots, soft at the edges. She'd been paid 2 days ago. Her shift at the hospital had run long, a double she'd picked up to cover the heating bill that had come due in October. The money had gone exactly where it always went. Rent, $1,200, electricity, $180, water, $65, car insurance, $140, Marcus's school fees, $300, Lisa's antibiotics, $240 after insurance. That left $75 for Christmas. She'd bought a used Monopoly game from a thrift store, wrapped in newspaper because she was out of paper. She'd made popcorn, strung it into garland for the tree, a small pine she'd cut from the edge of the woods 2 miles outside town, dragging it home behind her bike because she couldn't afford a car payment and the bus didn't run in that direction. The popcorn had taken 4 hours. The children had fallen asleep to the smell of it, cinnamon and salt, and Margaret had felt for a moment like she'd done something right. If you're watching this and you've ever wondered if kindness still exists, keep watching. This story will remind you exactly why it does. Now, at 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, kindness felt like a luxury item, and Margaret was running on fumes. She closed the refrigerator and stood in the darkness of her kitchen. The house groaned around her, old wood settling, wind pushing through gaps in the window frames. She thought about calling the landlord. He'd said the boiler was functional enough when she'd moved in. He lived 3 states away and answered emails once a month. She thought about the emergency fund, $340, sitting in a savings account she'd opened at the bank, money she'd been setting aside for exactly this kind of moment. But if she spent it on the boiler repair, what would happen in February? March? What if one of the kids got sick and needed the ER? Margaret pulled a chair to the kitchen table and sat down. The wood was cold under her legs. She stared at the window where snow continued its relentless fall, and she allowed herself for exactly 3 minutes to cry. When it was over, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. There was work to do. She pulled every blanket and sleeping bag they owned from the closet and piled them on the living room floor. She made hot chocolate on the stove, real cocoa, not the powdered kind, because this was Christmas and her children deserved that much, and carried the mugs carefully to the living room. Marcus and Lisa appeared in their pajamas, eyes wide, sensing the adventure in their mother's voice, when she suggested they all camp out together under the blankets like explorers in the Arctic. They didn't understand that their mother was terrified. They only understood that she was present, and that was enough. By 1:15 a.m., both children were asleep against her sides, their bodies warm under the weight of quilts and blankets. Margaret stared at the ceiling, her mind cataloguing the next steps. Call the landlord again, get 3 quotes for the repair, apply for emergency assistance from the county, pick up an extra shift at the hospital if Diane could watch the kids, sell something, anything. Her bike, her grandmother's ring, the guitar she hadn't played in 5 years. She didn't sleep. She waited for morning, holding her children close, and she made a silent promise to them both. I will figure this out. Somehow I will figure this out. What she didn't know was that someone else had already made a promise to figure it out too. 3 days earlier, Margaret had stood in line at Morrison's Market with a basket containing eggs, 2 cans of beans, ground turkey on sale, and a 6-pack of store-brand orange juice. The line was long, it always was the week before Christmas, and the woman ahead of her had turned around suddenly, bumping into her cart. "I'm so sorry," the woman had said, and Margaret recognized the look on her face immediately because she saw it in the mirror every morning. Exhaustion, desperation wearing a thin smile. "It's okay," Margaret replied and meant it. The woman, older, maybe 60, with silver hair and eyes that had seen hard miles, glanced at Margaret's basket, then at her own, then back at Margaret. Without a word, she stepped aside and gestured for Margaret to go ahead. "No, please," Margaret said. "You were here first." "I insist," the woman said. There was something in her voice that made argument feel pointless. This wasn't about politeness. This was about something deeper. Margaret moved to the front of the line. As she rang up her items, she felt the woman's presence behind her, steady and calm. When Margaret pulled out her wallet to pay, she noticed the cashier, a young girl, no more than 17, watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That'll be 47 $32, the cashier said. Margaret counted out bills. She was $2 short. She looked at the basket, trying to decide what to put back. The orange juice, probably. The children loved it, but they could go without for another week. "I've got it," the older woman said, and she placed 2 $5 bills on the counter. "No," Margaret said immediately. "I can't." "You can," the woman interrupted gently, "and you will. Because someone did this for me once, a long time ago, and I promised myself I'd pass it forward." The transaction was complete. The woman smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes, and then she was gone, disappearing into the crowded aisles of the store. Margaret stood there for a moment, holding her bags, something shifting inside her chest. She turned to look for the woman, thinking she should at least say thank you, but she'd vanished. Only the cashier remained, watching Margaret with that same unreadable expression. "That was Mrs. Hendricks," the cashier said quietly. "She comes in here every week and does that." My manager says she's given away thousands of dollars over the years. She's on some kind of, I don't know, list. List? Margaret asked. Yeah. My mum says there's a whole group of people, mostly older folks, some bikers, too. And they keep track of people who are really struggling. They help out, you know, anonymous stuff mostly. But Mrs. Hendricks, she said she liked to make eye contact. She said it mattered more that way. Margaret walked to her car in a daze, her bags in her arms, her mind turning over this information like a smooth stone. Someone was keeping a list. Someone was paying attention. She didn't know that Mrs. Hendricks had made a call that night, that she'd described a young Asian woman with 2 small children working herself to the bone, and that Mrs. Hendricks had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the woman's power bill had been written on a notice stuck to her refrigerator, due in 2 weeks, substantial, urgent. She didn't know that this call had been routed to a man named Derek Ryder Holloway, who'd been running the Pacific Ridge chapter of the Salvation Riders Motorcycle Club for 12 years, and that Derek had listened carefully, asked 3 questions, and then said, "I'll take care of it." She didn't know any of this, and that was exactly how Derek preferred to operate. Derek Holloway sat in his garage, a converted warehouse space on the edge of town that he'd been rebuilding for 6 years, with his hands covered in engine grease and his phone pressed to his ear. "I'm telling you, Ryder," Mrs. Hendricks said, her voice calm but firm, the way it always was when she'd decided something was going to happen. "The power company is shutting her off on the 24th if the bill isn't paid. Christmas Eve, 2 children. She's a widow." Derek set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. Around him, the garage hummed with the ambient noise of the club's after-hours space, the distant murmur of voices from the back room where Tiny and Marcus were working on a custom build, the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal, the hum of the overhead lights. "Amount?" Derek asked. "847s, overdue charges included." Derek nodded, even though Mrs. Hendricks couldn't see him. He was already running the math, already thinking through the channels. The club had a fund for situations exactly like this, money set aside from the legitimate businesses the riders ran, used for moments when people fell through the cracks of a system that didn't care about them. "Name?" Derek asked. "Margaret Chen. She works at County Hospital, 3 jobs total. Daughter Lisa, 6. Son Marcus, 8. Derek closed his eyes for a second. He could see the whole picture already, a shape he'd seen 100 times before, a pattern as old as poverty. A woman holding everything together with string and prayer. 2 kids who didn't understand they were the reason their mother was wearing the same cardigan every single day. "I'll handle it," Derek said. "I thought you might," Mrs. Hendricks replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "That's why I called you." After they hung up, Derek stood in his garage for exactly 2 minutes, thinking. Then he picked up his phone again and started making calls. This is where the story changes. This is where a promise gets made. If you've ever wondered what real brotherhood looks like, this is it. Keep watching. The first call went to Tiny, who ran the logistics for the club's supply runs. "I need someone to pay an electric bill. Tomorrow morning, before work. $847. I'm covering it, but I need it handled discreetly." "On it," Tiny said. No questions asked. The second call went to Sarah, who managed the community kitchen program the club had started 3 years ago. I need you to put together a Christmas dinner for 4 people. 1 adult, 2 kids, ages 6 and 8. Enough for 3 days. Good food, not charity food. Can you have it packed by 6 a.m.? 4 people, Sarah asked, and Derek could hear her already thinking, already planning. Sarah had been homeless once herself. She understood the weight of being known. 4, Derek confirmed. I'll have it done, Sarah said. The third call went to his brother-in-law, Pete, who was a licensed HVAC technician and had been volunteering his time with the club for emergency repairs. Got a boiler situation. Christmas Eve. I need you to go out, assess it, and get it fixed. Whatever it costs, I'm covering it. I'm texting you the address now. Done, Pete said. The fourth call, Derek took a breath before making this one, went to everyone. The group chat. 53 members of the Pacific Ridge chapter, scattered across 3 states, all of whom understood that a message from Ryder at 1:33 a.m. meant something was happening. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., we're doing a food run. 428 Maple Street. Family needs support. Show up quiet, show up strong, show up ready to remind someone that they're not alone. This is what we do. By 1:47 a.m., Derek had 47 confirmations. By 2:15 a.m., Sarah had texted photos of the packed meals: roasted turkey, vegetables, fresh bread, pastries, cheese, fruit, eggs, milk, juice, everything a family would need to have a real Christmas. By 3:00 a.m., Pete had confirmed he could get to the house by 6:30 a.m., and he'd already called in a favor to get the boiler part he needed delivered to his garage. Derek sat back down at his workbench and looked at the phone. He thought about Margaret Chen, whom he'd never met, whom he'd never see, but whose life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. He thought about the promise at the heart of everything the Salvation Riders did, the promise that said, "We see you, we know you're struggling, and you're not alone." It was a promise Derek had made a long time ago, in a very different context, to people he'd loved and lost. It was a promise he kept every single day in 100 small ways, and now it would be kept in this one specific, crucial way. He pulled up the address Mrs. Hendricks had given him and looked at the satellite image. A small house on Maple Street. Blue shutters, a driveway with a single car, old, well-maintained, clearly cared for. The house of someone who was doing everything right and still falling behind. Derek set his phone down and went back to his work, but his mind was already at 428 Maple Street, already seeing what would happen at dawn, already knowing that this was exactly why he'd survived everything he'd survived. This was the point. And now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. Margaret woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of Marcus coughing. She sat up carefully, extricating herself from the pile of blankets without waking Lisa, and placed her hand on Marcus's forehead. Warm, but not fevered. The cough sounded dry, probably just irritation from the cold house and the dry air. She made a mental note to keep an eye on it. If it developed into anything worse, she'd need to bring him to the clinic on Monday. The house was even colder than it had been when they'd fallen asleep. Margaret's breath came out in visible puffs. She pulled on her cardigan and a pair of wool socks and made her way to the kitchen, where she began the morning ritual. Fill the kettle, light the stove, make hot water for tea and oatmeal. At 5:52 a.m., Margaret was standing at her kitchen window, watching the pre-dawn darkness slowly lighten to grey, holding a mug of tea between her palms when she heard it. The sound started as a distant rumble, almost imperceptible, then grew louder, a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to shake the air itself. Margaret frowned, setting down her mug. It was too early for traffic, too early for much of anything. Then the motorcycles came. One turned onto Maple Street from the north, its headlight cutting through the grey dawn. Then another, and another. Within 30 seconds, a convoy of 15 bikes lined the street outside her house, their engines idling, creating a sound like a creature breathing, like the earth itself was awakening. Margaret's heart seized. She thought of sirens, of emergencies, of the 1,000 ways a morning could go wrong. She moved toward the front door, then stopped, uncertain. Was she dreaming? Was something wrong? At 6:04 a.m., Derek Holloway knocked on her door. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, weathered, wearing a black leather vest covered in patches, and when Margaret opened the door, he held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice calm and steady, "my name is Derek Holloway. We're here to help." Margaret stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Behind him in the driveway and on the street, more motorcycles were arriving. She could count them now. 15, 20, 30, more still coming. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Your power bill," Derek said simply. "It's been paid. There's a technician coming in about 30 minutes to fix your heating system. He'll have it running before noon. And we've brought some groceries, Christmas groceries, for you and your kids." Margaret couldn't speak. Her mouth had gone dry. By 6:15 a.m., there were 47 bikers lined up in her driveway and spilling onto the street. By 6:30 a.m., as Pete the HVAC technician pulled up to assess the boiler, Sarah and 3 other women from the community program began carrying boxes of food into Margaret's kitchen. Turkey, vegetables, bread, milk, eggs, cheese, wine, juice, pasta, sauce, flour, sugar, butter, enough food to feed a family of 4 for 2 weeks. Marcus emerged first, drawn by the voices and the rumble of engines, his 8-year-old eyes going wide as he saw the motorcycles. One of the bikers, a woman named Cheryl with silver streaks in her dark hair, knelt down and showed him the patches on her vest, telling him the story of each one. Within minutes, Lisa appeared too, drawn by her brother's wonder, and suddenly both children were being lifted onto the bikes for photos. Laughing with a sound Margaret hadn't heard in months, Margaret stood in her kitchen with her hands over her mouth, watching her children laugh, watching strangers move through her space with purpose and gentleness, watching her life change in real time. Derek found her there and stood beside her, not touching, just present. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because someone did this for me once," Derek replied. "A long time ago, when I had nothing, when I thought I was done. This—" He gestured to the organized chaos of help unfolding around them. "This is how we remember. This is how we pay it forward." By 7:00 a.m., Pete had diagnosed the boiler problem as a failed thermostat sensor, a $340 part that he happened to have in his truck. By 7:45 a.m., the heating system was running, warmth flowing through the house like a blessing. By 8:30 a.m., all the food was unpacked and organized. The kitchen transformed into something Margaret had only imagined before. Derek pressed a business card into her hand. "If you need anything," he said. Anything at all. You call this number. We take care of our own. I'm not part of your club, Margaret said weakly. You are now, Derek replied. That's how this works. 3 days later, on December 27th, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad, and she began to write. Dear Derek, I don't know where to begin. I've started this letter 47 times and torn it up each time because no words seem adequate. But I'm going to try. 2 years ago, I lost my husband. His name was James. He was a firefighter. He died in a building collapse while helping people evacuate. I was 28 years old, and suddenly I was someone's widow. I was someone's mother with 2 small children who didn't understand why their father wasn't coming home. I moved here to start over, to find a place where I could build something new. I worked hard. I worked every day. 3 jobs, barely sleeping, barely seeing my children because I was so focused on survival. I thought that was the point. Survival. I thought if I just kept moving, kept pushing, the loss would somehow be outrun. On Christmas Eve, when the heat died and the power bill came due and I realized I didn't have enough money for both, something broke in me. I sat on my kitchen floor in the dark and I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. I wondered if my children would have been better off with relatives, with people who could actually provide. Then you showed up. I don't know who you are, not really. I don't know the details of your life or your history or why you decided that a stranger's electric bill was your responsibility. But I know what you did. You reminded me that the world is still good. You reminded my children that there are people who help without being asked, who give without expecting anything in return. Marcus has asked every day since if the bikers are coming back. Lisa drew a picture of your motorcycle and hung it on her bedroom wall. These small miracles, they matter more than I can articulate. I asked around, and I learned some things about you. I learned that you've been doing this for years, paying bills, fixing furnaces, delivering groceries, rebuilding lives. I learned that your organization, the Salvation Riders, is a family of people who've all experienced hardship and decided to respond by lifting others up. I want you to know that you've changed my family, but more than that, you've changed me. I came to this town thinking I had to do everything alone, that asking for help was weakness. You taught me that community is strength, that connection is survival. I'm writing because I want to ask something of you. I want to join. I want to be part of what you're building. I don't know how to ride a motorcycle, and I don't know all the protocols, but I can cook. I can organize, I can show up, I can help. I can be the person for someone else that you were for me. Will you have me? With gratitude and respect, Margaret Chen. She sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote Derek's name on the outside. Then she set it aside and returned to her kitchen, where she began to plan. If this organization was based on paying forward, on remembering where you came from and reaching back to help others, then Margaret understood exactly what her role would be. She'd already been working 3 jobs. She could make it 4. She could use her skills in the kitchen to make sure that the next family in crisis didn't have to choose between heat and food, because there would be a hot meal waiting for them. She'd learned very suddenly and completely that survival wasn't the point. The point was connection. The point was keeping your promises. The point was seeing someone in need and deciding in that moment that they weren't going to face it alone. Margaret returned to her kitchen window and looked out at Maple Street, at the ordinary driveway where extraordinary things had happened. She thought about the motorcycles, lined up like a protective border, like a statement. You matter. You're seen. You're part of something bigger than your own struggle. She picked up her phone and made a call to the county hospital's HR department. "Hi, this is Margaret Chen," she said when someone answered. "I'm calling to see if there are any open shifts in the kitchen program. I'm interested in flexible part-time work, I have culinary skills, and I'm available immediately." By January 15th, Margaret had become a fixture in the community kitchen that the Salvation Riders maintained in a converted warehouse 2 blocks from their clubhouse. The space was large and industrial, stainless steel counters, professional-grade ovens, rows of shelving filled with donated goods and bulk supplies. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, a team of 15 to 20 volunteers would gather to prepare meals for the people on the watch list. Families in crisis, individuals experiencing hardship, people who'd fallen through the cracks of the official safety net. Margaret worked alongside Sarah, who'd initially trained her, and now ran the program full-time. There was also James, a former military chef who'd become homeless after his discharge and was now the program's official director. There was Cheryl, who'd been riding with the club for 8 years and had a gift for organizing volunteers. And there was Derek, who appeared regularly to check on operations and invariably ended up helping to prep vegetables or load the distribution vans. On this particular Thursday, they were preparing meals for a family of 5 whose father had suffered a heart attack and couldn't work. The mother had 3 kids and was barely managing. "Chicken," Sarah said, handing Margaret a cutting board. "We'll do a rice casserole, steamed broccoli, and a fresh salad, plus bread and a dessert. The kids are 7, 9 and 11, so we want something they'll actually eat." Margaret nodded and began working through the prep list with practiced efficiency. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd learned the protocol, quality ingredients, real food, nothing that screamed charity. Every meal was prepared with the same care that a restaurant would employ, because dignity mattered, because how you received help mattered just as much as receiving it. Derek came through the kitchen at 7:15 p.m., his vest off, wearing just a t-shirt that showed the tattoos covering his arms, most of them designs that she'd come to recognize as club-related, but a few that seemed purely personal. He began chopping garlic without being asked, moving with the comfort of someone who'd spent time in a professional kitchen. "You did this before," Margaret said, noticing his knife work. "Military?" Derek replied. "Served in the field kitchen before I got my current assignment with the club. Feeding people is feeding people. Combat zone or community center, the principle's the same." Margaret had learned not to ask too many questions about Derek's history. The Salvation Riders were made up of people from all backgrounds, veterans, ex-convicts, reformed addicts, people who'd survived things that would break most people and had come out the other side stronger. Derek clearly had a story, but he shared it only when it served the mission, not for its own sake. "Derek," she said carefully, "I wanted to thank you again for everything. I know I've said it, but—" "Margaret," he interrupted, not unkindly, "you've already thanked me. More than that, you've proven your commitment. You've joined us. That's the actual thanks. The rest is just words." Sarah looked between them with the knowing expression of someone who'd seen this dynamic play out before. "What you're learning," she said to Margaret, "is that Derek doesn't do things for recognition. Neither do any of us. We do them because we understand on a cellular level that the only way to survive loss is to transform it into purpose. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Subscribe if you believe people can change the world one meal at a time. Comment below, what does community mean to you? By 8:45 p.m., they'd prepared 37 meals for families in need. Each one was boxed carefully, labeled with heating instructions and allergen information, loaded into the van that Tiny would drive out for distribution early the next morning. As Margaret helped pack the last box, Derek appeared beside her again. "I got your letter," he said quietly. Margaret looked up, surprised. She'd given it to him a week ago. "I read it 3 times," Derek continued, "and I want you to know you're exactly what we need. Not just your skills, though those matter, but your understanding. You came here as a widow carrying loss, and instead of letting that loss calcify into bitterness, you transformed it into compassion. That's rare. That's something we value." "I'm still learning," Margaret said. "We all are," Derek replied. "That's the whole point. We're all still learning how to live after the things that tried to kill us. We're just not learning alone anymore." By March, Marcus had asked Derek 3 times if he could come ride on the motorcycle. Derek had deflected each time with the gentleness of someone experienced in managing children's expectations. But on the first warm day of spring, when the temperature climbed into the low 60s and the sun came out fully for the first time in weeks, Derek knocked on Margaret's door at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. "I want to take your kids on a ride," he said. "Nothing crazy, just around the block, with helmets, with safety, if you trust me." Margaret thought about her children, growing up in a world where they'd learned early that loss was random and security was fragile. She thought about what it meant to let them experience joy without fear, to teach them that there were trustworthy people in the world, people who made promises and kept them. "Okay," she said. At 9:15 a.m., Marcus and Lisa, both wearing helmets that Derek had brought in his truck, were sitting on the idling motorcycle. Marcus in front of Derek and Lisa, sitting in front of her brother, his arms around her to steady her. They rode slowly, carefully, around the block 3 times. Margaret watched from the porch, her heart in her throat, and saw her children's faces light up with wonder. When they returned, both kids were laughing, real, uninhibited laughter that seemed to come from deep inside them. "Again!" Lisa shouted, still seated on the bike. "Can we do it again?" "Maybe next Saturday," Derek said, and Lisa nodded, already counting down the days. As Derek helped them dismount, Margaret caught his eye and he smiled, the kind of smile that said, "This is what it's all for. This is why we do any of it." That afternoon, Margaret did something she hadn't done since her husband's death. She sat down and began writing in a journal, not letters but reflections. She wrote about Derek, about the motorcycles, about the community she'd found in the warehouse kitchen, about her children's laughter, about the moment she realized that grief, when properly transformed, could become generosity. "I think I understand now why Derek and the others do this work. It's not about the money or the hours or the sacrifice. It's about the knowledge that we're part of something unbreakable. When we feed a family, we're saying we see you. When we fix a heating system, we're saying you matter. When we show up with motorcycles and compassion, we're saying you belong. I've realized that James's death, while it broke something in me that I thought could never be repaired, also taught me something that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. It taught me that connection is everything, that the only real inheritance we leave is the way we showed up for people. My children are growing up differently than they would have if that building had never collapsed. They're growing up with a different understanding of the world, not that it's safe, but that it's cared for, that there are people who notice, who respond, who act. I'm part of that now. I'm one of those people. In April, Derek called a formal meeting of the Salvation Riders in the warehouse clubhouse. It wasn't a full chapter meeting, those happened monthly, but rather an intimate gathering of the core team, rider leadership, key volunteers, and the newest full members. Margaret was invited to attend, and she sat beside Sarah, nervous about what the meeting would entail. Derek stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding but not aggressive, and began to speak. "We're here to mark something important," he said. "Over the past 3 months, Margaret Chen has become part of what we do. She's worked in our kitchen, learned our protocols, and proven that she understands the foundational belief of the Salvation Riders. That community is a choice, that generosity is a discipline, and that everyone, without exception, deserves to be seen." Margaret felt her face warm as everyone turned to look at her. "I'm going to tell you something that's not in any of our bylaws," Derek continued, "because bylaws don't capture what we're really about. We're called the Salvation Riders because we believe in a very specific kind of salvation, not religious, not spiritual, but concrete and daily. We believe that people can be saved by other people, that lives can be transformed by showing up. That promises kept across years, and distance and difference are the most sacred things we have." He paused, looking directly at Margaret. "When you came into this community, you were broken. Your life had collapsed, and you were trying to hold it together alone. Someone saw you, Mrs. Hendricks saw you, and made a choice to help. And instead of accepting that help and disappearing, you asked to become the helper. That's rare. That's the thing we value most." Derek gestured, and Sarah stood up, handing Margaret a leather vest, club colours, the Salvation Riders patch prominent on the back and on the front, a small patch that indicated her role in the community kitchen program. "Margaret Chen," Derek said formally, "we invite you to become a full member of this organization. Not because you ride a motorcycle, though you're welcome to learn, but because you understand in your bones that we save each other. That's what we do." The room erupted in applause, genuine, warm, the sound of a family welcoming someone who'd proven they belonged. Margaret stood and took the vest, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled it on. It was heavy, heavier than she expected, and as it settled against her shoulders, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just community. This was family. This was a decision to stay, to build, to keep the promise forward into the future. She looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become essential to her life in just a few months. At Sarah, at James, at Cheryl, at Tiny, at Derek. She looked at people who'd been broken and had chosen to respond by helping others be whole. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "You don't have to say anything," Derek replied. "Just keep showing up. Just keep remembering that every meal we serve, every bill we pay, every moment we choose presence over absence, that's the point. That's all it ever is." 1 year later, on the anniversary of the day the motorcycles had arrived at 428 Maple Street, Margaret stood in the community kitchen preparing the ingredients for a celebration dinner. The Salvation Riders were hosting their annual gathering, a formal event where they honored the year's work, celebrated the families they'd helped, and welcomed new members. She'd thought a lot about what the past year meant. It meant she'd gone from working 3 jobs to working 2 jobs and volunteering 30 hours a week at the community kitchen. It meant Marcus had learned to read better, had started taking piano lessons, and had stopped having nightmares about his father's death. It meant Lisa had learned to ride a bicycle, had started drawing pictures that were hung on the refrigerator, and had started asking about helping other people. It meant Margaret had become someone she didn't recognize, happier, stronger, more connected to the world around her. As she worked, Derek appeared with someone Margaret didn't recognize, a woman, maybe 35, with red-rimmed eyes and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from struggling alone. "Margaret," Derek said, "I want you to meet Catherine. Catherine's experiencing some hardship right now, and I wanted her to see what we do here." Margaret instinctively understood. She wiped her hands and smiled at Catherine, a real smile, not a practiced one. "Come with me," Margaret said. "I'll show you." As they moved through the kitchen, Margaret showed Catherine the systems, the protocols, the way they approached food preparation with the same care that restaurant chefs employed. She introduced her to Sarah and James and Cheryl. She explained, in simple terms, the philosophy that underlay all of this work. People matter, effort matters, showing up matters. As she talked, Margaret saw Catherine's expression shift. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. The guard she'd been carrying loosened. "Do you actually care?" Catherine asked suddenly. "Or is this just obligatory helping?" Margaret set down the vegetable she was chopping and looked at Catherine directly. "I'll tell you the truth," she said. "1 year ago I was you. I had 2 kids, 3 jobs, and I was falling apart. I sat on my kitchen floor on Christmas Eve and wondered if I'd failed my family. Then Derek and 50 other motorcyclists showed up and changed my life. Not just with money or food or heat, though those things mattered, but with the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that other people saw me, that I belonged to something bigger than my own survival." She paused, then added quietly, "So yes, I actually care. I care because I remember what it's like to not believe anyone would." By the end of the evening, Catherine had signed up to attend the next Thursday kitchen session. She'd given Derek permission to help with her most urgent bills, and she'd received the same gift that Margaret had received a year ago, the knowledge that she didn't have to carry this alone. As the formal gathering began, Derek stood in front of the entire assembled group, nearly 200 riders and volunteers, and raised a glass. "I want to acknowledge someone tonight," he said. "Margaret Chen became part of our family 1 year ago today. She came to us as someone the world had broken, and instead of staying broken, she chose to become a healer. That's the Salvation Rider's way. We take what would have destroyed us, and we transform it into compassion." He looked directly at Margaret. "Margaret, we're grateful for you. And Marcus and Lisa," he nodded to her children, who were sitting at a special table with other kids from the program, "we're grateful for the privilege of being part of your lives." Thank you for watching this story. Subscribe to see more about the real people who choose to save each other. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds you what humanity can be. The Salvation Riders are real, not the individual names or locations, but the movement. Communities everywhere are choosing to show up for each other. If you want to be part of that, start today. Find one person you can help. Make one promise you can keep. That's how this works. That's how the world gets saved. One motorcycle ride, one meal, one moment of presence at a time. As the applause washed over her, Margaret stood and walked to Derek. She extended her hand, and when he took it, she pulled him into an embrace. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Derek replied. "Thank you. For remembering, for paying it forward, for being proof that this actually works, that broken people can become whole people who help other broken people become whole. That's what we needed. That's who we needed to be." Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the warehouse had been cleaned, Margaret drove home with her children sleeping in the back seat. She thought about the past year, about the weight of the leather vest on her shoulders, about the faces of families they'd helped, about Catherine's tentative hope as she'd taken the information about the Thursday kitchen sessions. She thought about her husband James, who died running into a burning building, and how his death had taught her something, that the only meaningful response to tragedy is to choose, every single day, to save each other. By the time she pulled into her driveway at 428 Maple Street, the place that had been her breaking point and became her rebirth, Margaret understood something fundamental. The promise Derek had kept when the motorcycles arrived wasn't just a one-time gift. It was the beginning of a lifelong commitment to see others, to show up, to remember that every single person deserved to be reminded that they weren't alone. She carried her children into the house, one at a time, tucking them into their beds. She kissed their foreheads and returned to her room, where she picked up the leather vest and held it against her chest. She was a Salvation rider now, not because she rode a motorcycle, though she'd started taking lessons, but because she understood, in the deepest part of her being, that salvation was something people gave each other, and she would spend the rest of her life giving it. Thank you for spending this time with us. If Margaret's story moved you, if you believe that one person can change a community, then be that person. The Salvation Riders need riders everywhere, people willing to notice, to act, to keep promises. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because these aren't just stories, they're invitations. They're proof that another way is possible. Join us.